Nubia Z60 Ultra Review. Introduction. An Ultra like no other, this one aims to offer an alternative to the mainstream camera phone with a setup that defies the norm. It's unusual in a few other ways, too, plus it comes in at a more than reasonable base price. Let's see if the Nubia Z60 Ultra was worth the wait. ZTE, the parent company behind the phone, is no stranger to odd camera choices, and we've seen a handful of models with 35mm equivalent main units under both the Axon and the Nubia brands. This, however, is probably the most advanced configuration of the lot, with large sensors all around and sensibly chosen focal lengths that will make the 35mm module stand out without leaving you feeling like something is missing. Another way in which it stands out, the Z60 Ultra is also among the largest smartphones that don't bend in half. The 246G weight may sound like a lot, but at least it has a 6000 mAh battery to show for it, the largest capacity on a phone that's not a power bank first and a phone second. It should also charge fast enough with its 80W adapter, though we'll admit that the lack of wireless charging did leave us a little disappointed. Capture, rear camera, 8K at 30 fps, 4K at 30/60/120 fps, 1080p at 30/60th frame per second, EuroIS, HDR10, 10-bit video, front camera, 1080p at 30 fps. Battery, 6000 mAh, 80W wired, PD 3.0, QC4. Connectivity, 5G, dual SIM, Wi-Fi 7, BT 5.4, aptX HD, aptX adaptive, NFC, infrared port. Miscellaneous, fingerprint reader, under display, optical, stereo speakers. Nubia Z60 Ultra unboxing. The Nubia Z60 Ultra ships in a regular-sized dark cardboard box with some red accents for a splash of color. The theme continues on the inside with a red USB-C cable with black connectors and a black charger with, you guessed it, a red USB-C connector. Also included is a clear plastic snap-on back cover that also offers limited coverage for the extreme corners. It won't save the Ultra in most falls, but it does add a little protection without compromising the looks too much. Build quality, handling. The Z60 Ultra is one large phone, and it makes no excuses for it. Flat display, flat sides, flat back, sharp corners, a thick camera bump that covers a third of the rear, it's a blocky handset alright. And it's not light either, at 246G, this is among the heftiest Ultras. What it's worth, the Z60 Ultra does manage to own this aesthetic, and just because pocketability is nowhere on its priorities list, the phone looks stylish and feels quite reasonable in both the hand and the pocket. It reminds us a little of the original Xiaomi Mix and the simpler times of almost a decade ago. What that Mix had was a chin, because back in those days, we didn't have under-display cameras. We do now. And the Nubia doesn't have to ruin its facade with either a thick bezel on one end or a cutout for the camera. Instead, its pixels are hidden behind the display pixels, creating an uninterrupted look. ZTE could have probably gone the extra mile and made the black border around the display a uniform thickness, but we'd understand if they had considerations beyond looks. Speaking of under-display components, there's also the fingerprint reader lurking from underneath the 6.8-inch OLED panel. It's placed nicely high up the central axis of the phone and requires no dedicated effort to operate. Your thumb just falls on the sensor, and the phone unlocks nearly instantly. The Z60 Ultra's physical properties, the flat frame that you'll be touching is made of aluminum and has a satin finish. It's not exactly fingerprint-proof, but it doesn't advertise smudges quite like a glossy frame would. The back panel of the phone is made of glass, not that ZTE explicitly says so, but we checked with a blade. It's got that anti-glare treatment that shimmers when placed under direct sunlight, and it's pretty good at repelling grease, though grippiness isn't its forte. And while the panel itself doesn't accumulate dirt, the area between the raised lenses for the main camera and the telephoto will pick up lint from your pocket. The camera island is a separate slab, raised from the main panel. If you're the kind of person that pokes at things they shouldn't poke at, you could wedge a fingernail in between the two pieces. And we're not sure what that means for the phone's dust and water protection, but since it has an IP68 rating, perhaps they've thought about it. And perhaps you shouldn't be sticking your nails in weird places. International buyers can get the Z60 Ultra in either black or silver colorways. China is additionally being treated to a blue version with what resembles Van Gogh's Starry Night painting displayed on the back and a Starry Night writing for those that skipped art history in school. There's also another China-exclusive option called Photographer Edition. It's got a faux leather back panel and some brushed metal-looking accent to emulate the styling of a classic rangefinder camera. To be fair, we wouldn't say that we're all too bummed about only getting the plain colorways. 6.8-inch uninterrupted slab of a display. The Z60 Ultra is all displayed on the front. Its 6.8-inch panel has minimal bezels all around, and thanks to the under-display camera, there's no unsightly punch hole either. It's got an unusual resolution at 1:116:2 480px, but perhaps Nubia was targeting the 400 ppi density. Of course, the panel supports a 120 Hz refresh rate, and the Ultra employs 2160 Hz PWM for flicker-free dimming. The official specs promise 500 nits of peak local brightness. In our testing, the phone was good for a little over 1000 nits with adaptive brightness enabled or 580 nits when adjusting it manually. These aren't record-breaking numbers, of course, but it's not a bad showing either. Refresh rate. The Z60 Ultra's display isn't the most adaptive regarding its refresh rate. There are no 10 Hz or 1 Hz modes. All we could observe was a drop to 60 Hz when you don't interact with the phone for a few seconds. That's in both auto and 120 Hz modes. The latter isn't a fixed refresh rate either. On a positive note, the phone was perfectly happy maintaining the 120 Hz refresh rate in gaming. The in-house gaming utility reported frame rates all the way up to 120 frames per second too. Apparently, the Red Magic gaming chops have made it to the Z Nubia too. Speed. The Z60 Ultra ships with an 80W adapter that can send up to 7.25 A of current at 5V, 11V or up to 3.8 A at 5V, 21V over its USB-C port. The supplied cable has a 9A marking on it. Using this adapter, we clocked the Z60 Ultra's charging time from 1% to 100% at 40 minutes. At the half-hour mark, we were looking at 87% and the phone was showing 51% at the 15-minute checkpoint. The iQOO 12 and the OnePlus 12 are indeed faster, and the Xiaomi 14 has a minor edge, but let's not forget that the Nubia has the largest capacity of the bunch. Plus, its result is anything but slow to begin with. Mind you, we got these numbers with the turbocharge toggle enabled, while turning it off will lead to a minor slowdown. The Nubia Z60 Pro lacks wireless charging, as does the iQOO. A lot of the others do have an induction coil though, and that could affect your purchasing decision one way or the other. Also a large brightness slider with an auto toggle, something missing in the default Android shade and in a lot of custom builds. As mentioned, the Z60 Ultra borrows the game space in-game utility that you might be familiar with from the Red Magic phones. It consists of two large symmetrical menus on each side of the display, with most of the functions readily accessible with a single tap. You can monitor your CPU and GPU frequency as well as, crucially, in-game FPS using an overlay. Most of the interesting and powerful settings are located in their own sub-menu within the overlay. X-Gravity is the system Nubia uses to map external devices like a controller or keyboard and mouse to on-screen controls. Auxiliary line is a way to define on-screen circles that appear around your character and signify things like the area of effect of certain skills or attacks. Stopwatches give the player an array of on-screen stopwatches to quickly time things like a skill or spell cooldown on enemies. The crosshair feature draws an overlay on the screen, and it can also zoom into a particular area of the frame. AI trigger, meanwhile, waits for a certain event to happen, say empty magazine, and it will automatically tap on the reload button. So yes, maybe you came here for the camera system, but you might be staying for the gaming prowess of the Nubia Z60 Ultra. ZTE has fitted a nicely large sensor here. At January 1st 55-inch, it's the largest on an ultrawide camera in a phone with a 35mm main camera. Or at least as best as we can tell. The lens is plenty bright too, with an f/1.8 aperture, and it's also stabilized. So the less extreme focal length is not without its benefits. The telephoto camera appears to be coming from the Nubia Z50 Ultra, a phone we haven't seen in person. It's a notable improvement over the one fitted on the Z50s Pro, and it's in many ways the same as the one that we saw on the Axon 40 Ultra, same sensor, minor differences with the lens specs. This one also features OIS, but what it doesn't have is close focusing. We've gotten used to nice close-ups from recent flagship teles, and you won't be getting that here. Nubia Z60 Ultra Review. Wide, main 50MP Sony IMX800, 54MP, January 1, 49-inch, 1.0mm, 2.0mm, f/1.6, 35mm, multidirectional PDAF, laser AF, OIS, 4K at 120fps, 8K at 30fps. Ultra-wide, 50MP Omnivision OV50E40, January 1, 55-inch, 1.0mm, 2.0mm, f/1.8, 18mm, multidirectional PDAF, OIS, 4K at 120fps. Telephoto, 64MP Omnivision OV64B40, 1/2.0-inch, 0.7mm, 1.4mm, f/3.3, 85mm, multidirectional PDAF, OIS, 4K at 120fps. Front camera, 12MP Omnivision OV12D2Q, 1/2.43, 1.4mm, 2.8mm, 16:9, f/2.0, 24mm, fixed focus, Full HD at 30fps. Daylight photo quality. Main camera, 35mm. Photos from the Z60 Ultra's main camera look great. They have minimal noise and excellent detail, and random textures are rendered in a reasonably likable fashion. The auto-white balance. When it comes to controls, the Z60 Ultra has the usual power and volume keys on the right. The power button is red and knurled, so you can tell it apart by either sight or feel. Both the power button and the volume rocker are metal and have a nice click action. In addition to these two standard keys, there's also a slider, knurled too, but with a crosshatch instead of the stripe of the power key. This one is used to open the camera app directly into street mode, which offers some extra functionality on top of the plain photo mode, grain filters, exposure parameters overview, an extra zoom preset level at 50mm. It's ultimately nice to have a dedicated camera shortcut like this, though we're not fully convinced that street mode is all that useful. Also a large brightness slider with an auto toggle, something missing in the default Android shade and in a lot of custom builds. As mentioned, the Z60 Ultra borrows the game space in-game utility that you might be familiar with from the Red Magic phones. It consists of two large symmetrical menus on each side of the display, with most of the functions readily accessible with a single tap. You can monitor your CPU and GPU frequency as well as, crucially, in-game FPS using an overlay. Most of the interesting and powerful settings are located in their own sub-menu within the overlay. X-Gravity is the system Nubia uses to map external devices like a controller or keyboard and mouse to on-screen controls. Auxiliary line is a way to define on-screen circles that appear around your character and signify things like the area of effect of certain skills or attacks. Stopwatches give the player an array of on-screen stopwatches to quickly time things like a skill or spell cooldown on enemies. The crosshair feature draws an overlay on the screen, and it can also zoom into a particular area of the frame. AI trigger, meanwhile, waits for a certain event to happen, say empty magazine, and it will automatically tap on the reload button. So yes, maybe you came here for the camera system, but you might be staying for the gaming prowess of the Nubia Z60 Ultra. The Z60 Ultra doesn't stray from the pack and relies on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 to do its number crunching. The Qualcomm high-end chip for 2024 is made on a 4nm process and features an octa-core CPU in a 1+3+2+2 layout, one Cortex-X4 Prime core at up to 3.3 GHz. The GPU is the Adreno 750. A whole bunch of memory configurations exist, spanning from a relatively modest 8GB per 256GB to a bonkers 24GB per 1TB. Not all of them are available outside of China, however, and global markets get 12GB per 256GB and 16GB per 512GB versions, maybe the base tier in some locales. We reviewed the 16GB per 512GB spec, and its storage speed was consistent with the UFS 4.0 standards numbers. In the benchmark runs that we did on the Nubia Z60 Ultra, it posted scores that placed it first among equals in the graphics department and also among the top performers in Geekbench and Antutu. There was no performance mode or anything, that's just what the phone scores. The 3D Mark Wildlife stress test is where things got hot. The 67% stability result there is better than a lot of the recent SD8 Gen 3 phones we've tested, Galaxy S24 Ultra, Zenfone 11 Ultra, Find X7 Ultra, but the Nubia achieved that by getting all too hot, impossible to hold hot. We understand that it's likely using the frame as a radiator, diverting heat away from the components that generate it, but it's too much. Meanwhile, other handsets with the same chipset, Honor Magic 6 Pro and Xiaomi 14 Ultra, managed similar stability scores in 3D Mark camera like no other. The Nubia Z60 Ultra follows in the footsteps of a handful of Axon and Nubia branded phones to feature a primary camera with a 35mm equivalent lens. A revered focal length in classic photography, 35mm is mostly overlooked on smartphones, where different pursuits have made the bulk of main cameras somewhere around the 24mm mark. Well, ZTE pushes on and continues to iterate on the subject, with this latest setup bringing yet more advanced hardware. Nubia Z60 Ultra Review. That said, the 35mm camera, in particular, is apparently unchanged from the one used on the Z50S Pro. That's not really a bad thing since it was already the best one of its, admittedly not widely used, kind. All the other efforts at 35mm use smaller images. The one here is a 54MP Sony sensor with a somewhat unusual optical format and aspect ratio, January 1 49-inch, 1.43:1, of which the Nubia is using a 4:3 crop for photos for a total of 12.5MP after the 4:1 binning. The 35mm equivalent lens has 7 elements, one of them made of actual glass, and it's stabilized. Nubia Z60 Ultra Review. The Z60 Ultra's ultrawide isn't quite as ultrawide as most competitors, at 18mm equivalent, but it pairs nicely with the unusually long focal length of the main camera. You see, a wider ultrawide would have made for too great of a coverage gap between the two, which was the case on the Z50S Ultra and most Axons, with the notable exception of the 30 Ultra, which had an extra 26mm camera in addition to the 35. Camera isn't the Z60 Ultra's only selling point though. If you enjoy some mobile gaming, you'll find the phone's wide-ranging feature set in that area most welcome, minus the hardware triggers. It's more or less a red magic gaming phone. The excellent gaming battery life, but also in general, is also scoring big points for the Z60 Ultra. Pros. One-of-a-kind camera system with an uncommon, and capable, main camera and better than most ultra-wide. Top-class battery life. Extensive gaming-related features. Cons. Bulky and heavy. Display not as bright or adaptive as the competition, no HDR10+, Dolby Vision, or Widevine L1 support. Heavy overheating under GPU loads. Mediocre selfie quality. Speaker test. The Nubia Z60 Ultra features a stereo speaker setup with a familiar arrangement. There's a higher-powered main speaker firing out the bottom and a secondary unit that outputs sound through a forward-facing slit above the display. Both speakers will play their own track plus the opposite channel at a lower volume. The phone does switch channels depending on orientation too. In our testing, the Z60 Ultra earned a very good rating for loudness, same as the Z50S Pro and most phones in the class. We can't say we enjoyed its sound too much though, it was relatively thin, with no bass and an overall mid-forward presence, hence the high integrated loudness. Use the playback controls to listen to the phone sample recordings, best use headphones. We measure the average loudness of the speakers in LUFS. A lower absolute value means a louder sound. A look at the frequency response chart will tell you how far off the ideal 0 dB flat line is the reproduction of the bass, treble, and mid frequencies. You can add more phones to compare how they differ. The scores and ratings are not comparable with our older loudspeaker test. With a starting price of $650/€750 for a 12GB per 256GB version or $780/€900 for a more lavish 16GB per 512GB spec, the Nubia Z60 Ultra isn't low on value. It's also a fairly unusual package, mostly thanks to the camera system that offers a very specific set of capabilities that you can't find elsewhere. In that sense, it's almost rival-less, but if you're not dead set on a 35mm camera, there are, of course, alternatives. Nubia Z60 Ultra Review. The first option that comes to mind is the OnePlus 12. At $800/€970 for a 12GB per 256GB spec, it's not as great a deal as the Nubia in some places, but it's more competitively priced in India. The OnePlus display is superior, as are its selfies, while the Nubia counters with longer battery life and better performance. We'd be leaning towards the Nubia as a camera phone in this bout, with its gaming prowess also scoring at extra points. Another gaming phone in mainstream attire, the Zenfone 11 Ultra also comes with an unusually wide set of features to cater to that demographic, though it's seemingly the Nubia that brings better sustained performance and battery life in that area. The Zenfone isn't as capable a camera phone though, pivoting hard towards the Xiaomi 14, which you might be able to squeeze into the budget for a 512GB Nubia. The Xiaomi will appeal to those who might be intimidated by the Z60 Ultra's size, offering camera phone excellence in a much smaller package. Naturally, the Nubia's size scores at points for battery life and HDR. The Z60 Ultra is not so keen on playing HDR content though. It only supports the HDR10 standard, so no HDR10 Plus and no Dolby Vision. We did get HDR streams from YouTube, but there was no HDR from Netflix. Not only that, but since the phone doesn't have Widevine L1, just L3, you won't be getting full-resolution DRM-protected content. Netflix is limited to standard definition. Nubia Z60 Ultra Battery Life. Our new active use score is an estimate of how long the battery will last if you use the device with a mix of all 4 test activities. You can adjust the calculation based on your usage pattern using the sliders below. You can read about our current battery life testing procedure here. For a comprehensive list of all tested devices so far, head this way. The Z60 Ultra is equipped with a 6000 mAh battery, one of the largest power packs in any reasonably mainstream phone. While there has been a push for higher capacities this year, potential rivals only go as high as 5500 mAh. With that in mind, the Z60 Ultra is set up for success in an endurance race. Indeed, the Nubia got a class-leading result in our active use test. Particularly impressive was its nearly 11-hour figure in gaming. Few flagships can achieve a feat of comparable magnitude. Also noteworthy is the 21-hour video playback result, and while 13 hours isn't quite as remarkable in the web browsing test, it's still an above-average showing. The voice call time is more in the OK category. iOS 14 on top of Android 14. The Nubia Z60 Ultra runs Android 14 with a layer of proprietary software on top dubbed MyOS, it too at v14. While it's technically not the same thing, it's also kind of the same thing as the Red Magic OS 9 that we got to experience on the Red Magic 9 Pro a while back. That sameness goes all the way to the extensive functionality of the Game Space utility, which makes the Z60 Ultra a gaming phone in disguise. Among the familiar and most obvious customizations in MyOS has been in the quick toggles area, where the initial swipe would get you 4 large bubbles for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, mobile data, and flashlight. That meanwhile became the default Android look, though MyOS take still has its own personality.